Another one of those dastardly damaging and downright distasteful delusions I often read about Titanic on the internet is regarding her completion. By the time of her maiden voyage, she was totally seaworthy and shipshape. The major systems required to propel her safely across the mighty North Atlantic were up and running, her sea trials successful. This was to be expected, as Harland & Wolff knew what they were doing. This company which constructed Titanic had been in business since 1861. They had a business contract with the White Star Line to deliver a completed Titanic for her maiden voyage. And if you know anything about the world of business, there's always conditions, protocols, and comeuppance if a contract isn't completed on time. But if unforeseen situations arise, and a delay occurred, such as when Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, needed to return to Belfast for immediate repairs, the two companies would compromise. Work shifted from finishing Titanic to repairing Olympic to get her back into service. One could say the men were switched from Titanic to Olympic, and Titanic's maiden voyage was delayed from March to April. If anything major were to arise in Titanic's fitting out schedule, it would have certainly delayed the voyage. And it did. But, there is always a but, that doesn't mean she was totally 100% undeniably finished when she left the British Isles on April 11th. Let's take a close look at some of the interesting little things that were finished on the ship right before the maiden voyage, sometimes right under the nose of those snotty first-class passengers, and examine a few more Titanic-sized misconceptions of her fitting out. At first glance, one might be surprised at the amount of rust found on a brand new ship. It seems White Star thought so too, and they had the ship's port side painted while at Southampton. Her funnels too were touched up, as the ladders were still unpainted. They received the famous White Star buff color. Painting an ocean liner was a task reserved for the bravest of men who didn't know it but could have been auditioning for the role of a Gilded Age Spider-Man. Ships need constant painting to protect the steel and iron from the harsh North Atlantic environment. 8-year-old Winifred Quick remembered her mother Jane leaving the door to their second-class cabin ajar due to strong odors from the fresh paint. Titanic would have been painted hundreds of times throughout her life if she survived, but close examination of her sounding spar, a device used to check the depth of water while in port, shows they missed a spot. Oopsie. Many sundry items in the passenger areas were still being furnished, from chairs and tables and even doors and clocks. Eleanor Casebeard noticed the wall notices were absent from her cabin when she was told to look for her lifebelt. H.B. Mutters and Zoon from Holland, specializing in interiors and furniture for many shipping lines, sent directly to Southampton, sometimes with free shipping, many chairs and tables for Titanic's reception room and palm courts. The fabulous faux ivy, that's right, Titanic did not have growing ivy, for the trellis in the Café Parisien was finally installed, and some of the gym equipment was properly positioned. There was time to get all the needed furniture to Titanic for the voyage. If you see something in a museum labeled, "Just Missed the Boat," think about it for a bit. Furniture was arriving from the Netherlands just days before she sailed, so unless it was coming from the moon, chances are that furniture that was supposed to be intended for Titanic wasn't ever intended to be aboard her in the first place. Same goes to your friend's great-great-uncle, who also missed Titanic's voyage. There does seem to be some mix-up when it came to the electrics, venting, and plumbing for cabins and passenger areas. After she left the UK, a few passengers reported that their steward call buttons or light switches didn't properly work, and they needed to move cabins. The taps and other sink fixtures for a lavatory in second class weren't ever installed, and the heating was sometimes sporadic. Olympic had a dreadful time getting her ventilation and heating correct, and many changes were made to Titanic attempting to improve the situation. This wasn't enough for one second-class passenger on the maiden voyage. Mrs. Amanda Shelley complained that her cabin, or cell as she put it, was too small. Yet she was promised, quote, the best second-class accommodation. It was also far too cold, and she was supposedly in grave danger due to it, especially if the purser did not act, and she would certainly have to claim damages if she was lucky enough to live and reach her native land of America. She demanded to move after the experience made her oh so ill, and 4 stewards had to pick her up and bring her to a much larger, but just as cold cabin. Americans. Missing from the only photograph of Titanic's Turkish baths are the lovely stylized table lamps. Were they never included on Titanic? Are they just unpacked or in a linen room? None were ever seen when the room was explored decades later. So this is a mystery which possibly will forever be cascaded in darkness. Outside the gym, there are several missing railings. It is claimed that workers were too busy elsewhere that they forgot to install a few bits of rails. But these gaps were no accident. This highlights an interesting feature of Titanic's passive ventilation system. Certain windows in the gym and the first-class entrance had their lower sections swing open, allowing fresh air to cascade in. The swing of the window required the rails to be removed. So no, the workers weren't lazy or thoughtless when it came to handrail installation. Speaking of the opposite of lazy, Thomas Andrews and his guarantee group were aboard to find elements of the ship either not working or preparing them for improvements. A hot press in the restaurant was malfunctioning, the stucco in the private promenade was requiring another staining, and he was already suggesting altering the seldom used reading and writing room to become cabins. Olympic and Britannic would eventually receive this modification. There aren't any stories or accounts of major passenger accommodations being incomplete. It would be far too difficult to finish these apartments while away from the shipworks. According to May Futrell, the doors of the Café Parisien were being installed by the crew the morning of the 11th. Perhaps they were adjusting and planing them in their framework after the ship's woodwork had settled, illustrating how the crew were taking care in perfecting this ship. However, there was one legend that just won't die surrounding the grand staircase clock. Honor and Glory herself was not completed or installed. According to one source, master craftsman Charles Wilson, the carver who created the surround named Honor and Glory, claimed a mirror was put in the circle center where a clock was meant to go when she left Belfast, instead of a clock, due to a lack of time. However, since this clock, a slave clock, part of a system of clocks on the Magneta system, the wiring would have been installed behind the paneling in the room and run all the way to the bridge forward. So everything necessary to install the hands and face would be right there, behind this mirror. If this were the case, Titanic had April 3rd to April 10th sitting idle with hundreds of workers buzzing around her, many of them electricians, able to both obtain and install a clock. Clocks were very important on board ships, as passengers used them to adjust their own pocket watches while sailing to and fro across time zones. There is no doubt that this crowning piece of the ship was finished in time. Titanic might have had some missing buttons and lights, or painting that was still fresh, but she was seaworthy and strong. I'm sure there are many, but have you heard any other stories that she was incomplete? Let me know in a comment, and I will either look into it, or I'll let you know it was just one of the countless creations contrived to create clickbait.